Lyn Alden on how to survive the gradual print era, from the Bankless podcast with hosts Sean Adams and David Hoffman. This massive 103-minute interview is one of the most intellectually rich macro conversations you will hear all year, covering everything from the fourth turning and Fed independence to gold's explosive run, Bitcoin's disappointing cycle, the rise of a multipolar monetary order, and what investors should actually do with their portfolios. Section 1. The fourth turning and why everything feels like it is happening at once. The episode opens with a perfect tweet that captures the current mood. Someone online wrote, "I honestly have no idea if we are close to a crash, a melt-up, World War III, an industrial revolution, a mother of all short squeezes, a depression, a recession, or aliens, but it sure feels like all of them all at once." Lyn Alden's explanation is both quantitative and historical. She argues we are firmly in the fourth turning, the rough side of the long-term debt cycle that typically lasts about 80 years and brings everything crashing together at once. The mechanics are straightforward. Over decades, debt builds up through cycles of crisis and recovery, with each recovery starting from a higher debt baseline. Interest rates get cut to zero. Then the system shifts from private sector leverage to public sector leverage, which is exactly what happened after 2008. When the debt is on the sovereign level, it cannot go anywhere other than currency devaluation, because most sovereigns with their own currency will rarely ever default nominally. Instead, they default through purchasing power debasement and by trimming prior guarantees about retirement and social programs. These are what Lyn calls invisible defaults. David Hoffman maps out the timeline. The last fourth turning lasted from 1929 to 1945. This one likely started around 2008 and could last until 2030 to 2033. The parallels are striking. Rising political polarization, loss of trust in institutions, centralized industrial policy, and sovereign debt crises all tend to coincide. Add demographics issues for the first time ever, with future generations smaller than prior ones, and social media that lets you meme about the downfall of empires in real time, and you get the chaos we see today. Section 2. The Fed independence crisis and the 1940s parallel. The conversation takes a dramatic turn when they discuss Fed Chair Jerome Powell's January 11th announcement that he was under criminal indictment by the Trump administration. Powell went directly to the American people, saying the stated reason was budget overruns on a Fed building, but the actual reason was that Trump wanted him to lower rates and he refused. Lyn tweeted, "Whoa," and then called it the most direct clash between the Fed and the executive branch since 1951. Lyn walks through the history in fascinating detail. In the 1930s and 40s, the Treasury literally took the Fed's gold and gave them gold certificates in return, which she hilariously describes as basically memecoins. It was banned for individuals to own gold. The Fed was forced to do yield curve control, holding the short end at just over 0% and the long end at 2.5%, while peak inflation hit 19% year over year. Anyone holding currency or bonds got absolutely killed. You would have wanted equities, real estate, or bootleg precious metals, which were illegal. The Fed only got its independence back in 1951 through the Treasury-Fed Accord. Now, with debts at similar levels, that independence is being challenged again. Ryan Adams suggests Trump is simply saying the quiet part out loud, that the Fed has not truly been independent since 2008. Lyn largely agrees, noting that Fed independence was never really tested when everyone agreed on policy. It is only when there is disagreement that independence gets challenged, and this is the first real disagreement since the current era began. Section 3. Kevin Warsh, the new Fed nominee, and the gradual print. The discussion about Trump's nominee for Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, is nuanced. Warsh has a contradictory profile. He rage quit the FOMC in 2010 over quantitative easing, suggesting hawkish tendencies, but he also talks like a populist about the Fed pumping up asset prices at the expense of Main Street. Lyn's assessment is that Warsh will likely lean dovish on interest rates, using AI productivity gains as justification, while being slightly more conservative on balance sheet growth. But here is the crucial insight. Lyn introduces her concept of the gradual print. We have moved away from Fed balance sheet reduction toward gradual balance sheet increases. She pushes back against those expecting either massive money printing or significant balance sheet reduction. The constraints are real. Without major regulatory changes, it is very hard to reduce the balance sheet below current levels. The Treasury has been shortening its debt duration toward T-bills to avoid pressuring the long end of the yield curve, but that ironically requires a larger cash balance at the Fed. Meanwhile, Cutting short-term interest rates may not even impact long-term rates much, meaning mortgage rates could stay elevated regardless of what the Fed does. The overall outcome, regardless of who chairs the Fed, is constrained to a relatively narrow band of possibilities. Section 4. Gold's explosive run and the multipolar monetary order. The gold conversation is electric. Central banks around the world are diversifying away from treasuries toward gold, driven by the financial Cold War between the US and China, the frozen Russian bank accounts, and the trade war adding further incentive for countries to have more options. Lyn argues gold has mostly been a revaluation from undervalued to fairly valued, not a structural bubble, though it clearly got locally overbought in recent months. She mentions the yen carry trade as a background factor, where Japan's gradual shift toward hawkish policy can cause unexpected blow-ups in seemingly unrelated markets as leveraged positions get unwound. On the future monetary order, Lyn paints a compelling picture. No fiat currency, including the dollar, is big enough to serve the whole world anymore. When the dollar system was established, the US was over 40% of global GDP. Now, with China, India, and Europe recovered, you need either diversification across multiple currency blocks or neutral reserve assets that bridge them. Gold is the incumbent neutral reserve asset, with the caveat that it is slow and expensive to audit. When Germany wanted to repatriate its gold, it took years. Bitcoin's settlement, by contrast, gets 6 confirmations in an hour. She describes China as wanting to go halfway. They want their own currency ecosystem and to reduce dollar dependency, but they do not want to recreate the Triffin dilemma. They want to buy commodities in their own currency, keep it stable enough for trade partners, and exchangeable for gold. The US, meanwhile, is trying to have its cake and eat it too, wanting countries to use the dollar and come to trade deals while also stepping back from global commitments. As Lyn puts it, it is almost like saying we want the world to pay tribute to the empire, and that posture is untenable and adding to volatility. Section 5. Bitcoin's disappointing cycle and the quantum question. Lyn is refreshingly honest about Bitcoin's performance. She admits it has underperformed her expectations this cycle, with Bitcoin only reaching 126K against her informal target of anything under 150K being disappointing. She attributes some of this to treasury companies like MicroStrategy absorbing euphoria that would have otherwise gone directly into Bitcoin, and to the self-fulfilling prophecy of the 4-year cycle, where enough OG holders sold in anticipation of a 2026 bear year that it actually created one. On the 4-year halving cycle, Lyn argues it fundamentally does not matter anymore because the new supply has gotten so small relative to other factors like OG selling rates and new institutional buying. But psychology lags fundamentals, so it takes a couple of cycles for that behavioral change to catch up. She also cautions against banking on a sovereign Bitcoin reserve saving any cycle, noting that the status quo for governments is no change, and she would rather be surprised to the upside. The quantum computing discussion reveals how this risk is actually affecting institutional buying decisions right now. Even if the technical threat is years away, institutions are fattening their left-tail bear case, which brings down their average price targets and reduces position sizes. A committee that might have had 5 out of 9 votes for a 5% Bitcoin allocation now only gets 3 or 4 votes because of quantum uncertainty. This is a real headwind that is not visible in the headlines, but is showing up in actual capital allocation decisions. Section 6. Ethereum, Stablecoins, and Portfolio Strategy. David Hoffman asks Lyn about the Bitcoin versus Ethereum debate, and she is gracious but firm. She has been in the Bitcoin camp for network effect and decentralization reasons, and the market has vindicated that position this cycle. On stablecoins, she has been bullish for years but sees a ceiling. People only want so much non-interest-bearing dollars. Some countries will push back with regulations, and the Triffin dilemma still applies since widespread stablecoin use makes it harder to fix the trade deficit. For portfolio strategy, Lyn's approach is diversification across stocks, gold, Bitcoin, and cash. She's not in the camp of all in on any single asset. Her gradual print thesis suggests continued but moderate monetary expansion, meaning equities and real assets should do reasonably well. But the sensationalist calls for either a dollar collapse or a deflationary spiral are both unlikely in the near term. The consequences of the fourth turning are already hitting, from political polarization to inflation to central bank diversification to trade wars, but they come in bursts separated by periods of apparent calm. The most extreme predictions are rarely correct, and these things take longer to play out than people think, even though they are punctuated by occasional exclamation points. Key takeaways. We are in a fourth turning characterized by the gradual print, where the Fed will slowly expand its balance sheet regardless of who chairs it, because the constraints of high debt levels and market stability requirements leave very few other options. Gold's run is fundamentally justified as a revaluation from undervalued to fairly valued, driven by central bank diversification and the financial Cold War, though near-term overbought conditions can create volatile pullbacks. Bitcoin has underperformed expectations this cycle, but the long-term thesis of a decentralized ledger remains intact, with quantum computing emerging as a real headwind to institutional allocation. The monetary order is shifting toward multipolarity with gold and potentially Bitcoin as neutral reserve assets, bridging competing currency blocks. And the most practical advice is to own multiple asset classes, maintain conservative expectations, and recognize that these massive structural shifts play out over years and decades, not months.